Greetings and durud. Welcome to today's latest edition of the 2024-25 Iranian Studies Initiative lectures in collaboration with the University of California, Santa Barbara. I am Alireza Ardekani of Farhang Foundation, a member-supported, non-political, non-religious, not-for-profit organization with the sole mission to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture for the benefit of the global community. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Soraya Tremayne from the University of Oxford for Inconceivable Iran, to reproduce or not to reproduce. This series is made possible with the generous support of the Geramian Emrani Foundation. Please note that we will be holding a Q&A session at the end of today's talk. So please do submit your questions to Dr. Tremayne via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Janet Afari, renowned scholar and the director of the Iranian Studies Initiative at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mr. Ardekani. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Professor Soraya Tremayne. She is a social anthropologist and the founding director of the Fertility and Reproduction Studies Group at the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Oxford. She's also the former director of the International Gender Studies at the Department of International Development Studies, also at the University of Oxford. She has served on the Council of the Royal Anthropological Institute between 1993 and 2014 in various capacities. And before that, she was director of the Ethnographic Museum of Tehran, Musée Mardom Shenasi. Dr. Tremayne is also the founding editor of the book series Fertility, Reproduction, and Sexuality with Bergham Books in Oxford. Her latest work, with its fascinating title, Inconceivable Iran, to reproduce or not to reproduce, was also published by Bergham Books in 2023. This is an important and most welcome publication by a pioneering anthropologist of Iran, known for her groundbreaking research on fertility and reproduction in the Middle East and the Global South. The book brings together 12 of her best articles written over a period of 3 decades. It focuses on her research on fertility in Yazd, which, for those of you who don't know, it's about 600 kilometers south of Tehran, in Tehran, and also among diaspora Iranians in the United Kingdom. It is full of stories and anecdotes which she collected in the course of her research and makes for an absolutely fascinating read. We're delighted to have you with us, Dr. Tremayne.
Thank you very much, Professor Afari and Mr. Ardekani, for the introduction. I am delighted and privileged to be here with you, sharing some of my findings over several decades of research. So what I am going to talk to you about is an abstract of the book, pointing out at the major findings of the book. But to begin with, I want to answer 2 questions. First, why reproduction? And then why now? Before I go into the actual book, I would like to share a story with you. As an Iranian, I must always start with a story, which shows what was the inspiration behind the choice of these chapters for this book. This goes back to 1997, when I was still the director of the Gender Studies, when the World Bank asked me to go to Tehran to devise a strategy for mainstreaming gender among the civil servants in Iran. This was a follow-up from the Beijing Conference of 1995 on women. So I spent several weeks in the Bureau of Women's Affairs in 1997, talking to a number of people and hearing their stories. And most of these stories were about the population policies, which had started in the mid to late 1980s, called the Family Planning Program, to reduce our population growth, because the Iranian population was growing at the time at the rate of 3.9 per annum. The stories were fascinating. The women in the bureau would tell me, our children come home and tell us, Mother, please don't have more than 2 children in our family. We are ashamed to go to school to tell people that there are so many children in our families. Another woman would say, my daughter has come from school saying, why are you having so many children? You are not a battery hen. And on and on and on over the weeks, I heard all. And this population studies, which started in the 1930s, was a follow-up to the revolution in 1979, where the previous Pahlavi regime's antinatalist policies were dismantled. And Ayatollah Khomeini said that Iran must have more population, and Iran war had started at the time, and we must have an army of 20 million, and so on. It was a very well organized and coordinated program. I'm not going into that. I am not a demographer. I am only looking at the population studies from an anthropological perspective, trying to explain some of it. This program was so useful that by 1996, the census showed the average population growth 2% per annum, and the population went into decline. So by the time the census of 2011 was shown, the average population growth had fallen below the replacement level. And it continued to today, the population growth is at 0.7 per annum. So Iran's population policy program was so successful that Iran won the UN's award for population, exemplary success. By 2020, Iran's fertility had dropped by 70% over 30 years, the highest decline in human history reported by various studies, including the Tehran Times. This is a table which shows you, but from 1956, there doesn't seem to be a figure about average annual growth, but you can see that from 1966, the growth has gone, it shows it until 2014. And then by 2024, the rate of population growth, as I said, had fallen to 0.7 per annum. When at 2011, under Ahmadinejad, when the population showed to have fallen below the replacement level, Iran reversed its population policies and went into implementing a pro-natalist policies. But that wasn't successful. But when Raisi became the president, in a few months of his presidency, he introduced a pro-natalist policy called the rejuvenation of the population and protection of the family. And these policies were extremely coercive and continued today, but so far they have not produced the results that the government would like to see. So at the same time, as we have a population declining and people in the generation of reproductive age not producing the number of children which is asked of them, we also have got a high number of married infertile couples. I came across that when I was studying in Yazd, when I was working on early marriages in the clinics and hospitals, where the treatment of infertility was fairly recent in Iran. And I came across infertile couples. And that also interested me because having seen the 1986 population policies, I was beginning to believe that people's reproductive values had really changed. Those norms and practices, traditional ones, have gone away because people are now believing that small-sized family and having smaller number of children was the norm. But then when I saw people clamoring outside the infertility clinic doors, coming from far away, camping at the doors for days and weeks to get a turn to have treatment for their infertility at the infertility IVF clinics made me think again. And at that point, my interest shifted from gender and women's studies per se into looking into reproduction. And of course, women and gender studies are embedded throughout the studies of reproduction. So Iran also has got a very advanced infertility treatment facilities offering treatment through assisted reproductive technologies. And although throughout the Muslim world, the Sunni do not allow the use of third-party gametes donation or under any form, only IVF between a married couple is allowed. The Iranian cleric jurists, Shia jurists, found ways of allowing the IVF treatment under especially third-party donation by a stranger in all its forms. So egg donation, sperm donation, surrogacy, embryo donation, all were legitimized, all of them through fatwas, except for embryo donation, because no amount of ijtihad which leads to fatwas could justify the use of embryo donation. So embryo donation has got a law on it, but not all the other ones. Well, these are explained in details in the book, so I will not go into them. But the infertility treatment, actually visiting the infertility clinics, I saw they were an epitome of reproduction in all its manifestations. Kinship was enacted, families' involvement, importance of relatedness, importance of lineage, importance of blood relation were all displayed in this clinic. So now you are putting, on the one hand, the infertile people wanting children, on the other hand, voluntary childlessness. So how to make sense of all these things, all these paradoxes that we are witnessing? So in this to examine all this, I decided to put number of my past and recent studies together, those chapters, those publications which were relevant to the issue of reproduction. So there are mainly 4 main themes in the book. Is the reproductive politics and population control, the institutions that surround reproduction, like kinship, marriage, family, fertility. There is quite a few chapters on infertility and the emergence of assisted reproductive technologies, because infertility had become a lens through which I could actually study how much and to what extent the reproductive values of people had been affected, and innovation and modernity and globalizations had been able to penetrate some of these values. To allow the use of IVF and assisted reproductive technologies, as I said, needed approval by the Islamic jurists. So the Shia religion played a very important role in allowing the use of these reproductive technologies. Of course, we know among the Shia, there are several sources of emulation, mujtahids, and each mujtahid has got his own followers. So not every mujtahid was in favor of using the involvement of a third party in procreation, but those who were in favor of it allowed it, and the clinics followed them, and that is how it became a practice. Now, in the ebbs and flows of reproduction, going into the chapters in the book, when you look at the history of the 1979 revolution, when Iran became an Islamic Republic, reproduction was a key target of reform in the Islamic Republic, because the authorities recognized that the reproductive values had been destabilized in Iran through modernity, and they wanted to bring in measures to make them go back to their roots. As we know, they dropped the age of marriage and brought in a whole number of measures to protect the family and go back to traditional values. And some of them have been quite coercive, some of those measures. However, the norms and practices that were the target of the authorities were the very ones that have undergone more change than any other institution in the society. We saw a dramatic reduction in the size of the family. We saw a rise in voluntary childlessness or having a smaller number of children, a delay in the age of marriage, and a drastic rise in the rate of divorce, all of them affecting the structure of the family and the kinship. For example, I heard this, in the 2019, marriage increased by 4.4%, but divorce went up by 3.6%. And I recently read one of the documents released by Iran that out of every 5 marriage, 1 ends up in divorce, average. So we can't say that the efforts of the government had been very successful in trying to force people to return to their traditions. Of course, we see one of the efforts, for example, of the government to restore the traditional values was in the education, which increased the female education drastically. And this is in one of the chapters in the book. The reason for Golnar Mehran, our colleague, has written a lot about that issue. For example, the reason why the female education became so successful and welcomed by all layers of society was the sex segregation at school, which people from conservative layers of society agreed to send their daughters to school. And the idea was to actually educate women into becoming good Muslim citizens. And as we have witnessed, some of that has backfired, of course. There are also, as I say, through the study of the infertility, you will see the survival of the family bond and family kinship. However, I'm going to talk about the points which have emerged from the studies in this book. Obviously, we know that Iranian culture is not monolithic. The country is home to considerable cultural diversity. However, the findings of the chapters carried out over several decades show that Iranians nevertheless share strong and deep-rooted values on issues of reproduction at all layers of society. You can see that in chapters 1 and 3 of the book. The other finding is that a distinction between social change and fundamental cultural values have to be made. A number of studies, abundant number of studies have come up recently that say that social change has resulted in the disappearance of core cultural values, and including on reproduction. I think it is important to actually make this distinction, because while I am not arguing that change has not happened in Iranian society, what one has to look at is at the complex dynamics of the encounter between modernity and tradition, and the multiple ways that people accepted innovation and respond to it and engage with it. And that is what determines the extent of change and how change can alter values. In other words, there are cultural barriers. There is a limit to what the innovation can do in the face of core cultural values in a society. What I'm really saying is that these values, faced with change, with modernization and globalization, the fundamental values are adaptable and interact selectively with innovation. It is not that innovation has wiped off all cultural values. Other points emerging has been very clearly that the relationship between the state and the citizens and what concerns their reproduction. The state is demanding of the citizens to produce more than 2 children so that the population can start growing. And as I mentioned, the policies have become gradually more and more coercive. But so far, since 2011, when the pronatalist policies, the antinatalist policies were reversed and pronatalist ones were come to play, these policies have failed so far. And the authorities are blaming the generation of reproductive age. To begin with, they say, oh, it is because the economic conditions are difficult, people don't want to have children. Anise Khazali under Raisi changed that and said it is the unrealistic ambition for different lifestyles among the young people which stops them from having children. Anything but admitting that actually the young generations of reproductive age are resentful of the interference of the state into their lives. This is a very important aspect which the authorities will not admit. In reality, various studies have shown that most people, most families have 2 children or 1. Some choose to go childless and not have children. But this is not because the reproductive values have changed. It is because it's a kind of rebellion by young people who don't want the revolution, the state to be dictating to them how to conduct their reproductive life. Another finding of the study is that while the age of marriage has gone up and the rate of divorce has gone up, there has been an increase in the traditional forms of marriage. For example, child marriages have gone up. Or of course, it could be argued that it's under poverty. Many people have been forced to do that, but also evidence shows that in still many parts of very traditional areas of Iran, Khuzestan, Baluchistan, and some others, some of these are not under pressure. So that has, or maybe we are getting more information now about it than it was before. But what is also interesting is the cousin marriages, consanguineous marriages, are on the increase. And one reason is the rate of divorce so high because people are now meeting online and deciding to get married, and the marriage doesn't last. All that family bonds which kept people who are relatives together in a marriage, whether happy or unhappy, they are not there anymore. So there has been a return to consanguineous marriages, which are anyway still quite high in Iran. The other aspect which emerges from the findings of the book is that the family and the kin group continue to control reproductive life, albeit in different forms. I mean, for example, depending on the background of the family, some families may be less intrusive, some conservative ones are keeping strict control. But again, in the infertility clinics, the extent of involvement of family in the reproductive life of couples is really very interesting. I mean, I have noticed brother-in-law coming to the clinic for his brother and sister-in-law, banging on the table, shouting at the doctor, wanting him to do everything to help them reproduce a child. I have seen families selling their cars or their houses to pay for the treatment of IVF so people can have children. Another aspect is, for example, you will find in white marriages, which is a form of cohabitation which is on the increase in Iran, many young women who have come from cities outside, areas outside the big cities, who enter into a cohabitation, white marriage with somebody, but eventually they have to return to their family and to their home. And when they do that, obviously, that is the control of the family. Under the family pressure, they get married, they have children, and some of them, because they have had a relationship during their white marriage, possibly abortions, find themselves infertile, and they end up in the infertility clinic. And it shows the extent of involvement of the family in the reproductive life of people. Another very interesting aspect, and this came out again through the lens of infertility, studies of infertility, lineage and biological relatedness remain paramount in Iranian society, including case of infertile couples who receive gametes from strangers. Obviously, that is a form of intrusion into the marriage. There's one reason why the Sunni don't allow third-party donation, because they think it's a form of adultery and intrusion into the family life. So receiving gametes from a stranger means that your lineage has been adulterated. You are not, it's not pure anymore. So it's very interesting how this has evolved over the past 20, 25 years when IVF started, the third-party gamete donation started, that to begin with, people would bring their relatives to receive gametes from them for a variety of reasons, but also one important aspect was to actually retain the blood links within the family. But as the practice of IVF, third-party gamete donation continued, and some couples were able to receive gametes without letting their wider family know about it, then they hid it from the family that they had received gametes from outside clinics. And they said, no, we just had IVF and it's our own child. So that is still ruling supreme, the sort of lineage and biological relatedness. Another interesting finding was that purity remains a concept as a core value in reproduction. And to the extent that it affects women's sexuality and control of women. You will find that, for example, in the case of women, girls, unmarried girls who have had sexual relationship, it then resorted to hymenoplasty. So at marriage, they can become virgins again. And this was so widespread that in early 2000s, Ayatollah Rouhani, no relation to President Rouhani, was asked whether the repair of the hymen was allowed. He immediately issued a fatwa and said, yes, this was allowed, and there is no difference between a restored hymen and a natural hymen. So this has also been practiced a great deal. Another aspect which is very looming large is the persistence of gender equality and patriarchy throughout the chapters in this book. But they all take different forms. For example, patriarchy, in one of the chapters, which is about 4 phases of Iranian fatherhood, it shows that how different layers of society are resorting to different means to remain controlled and remain in charge of the family. That's one aspect. One important one in the study of population studies is that the reproduction used as effective institutional tool by various Iranian states have been used to serve the nation-building policies. And there is a chapter which goes back to the Qajar period, 150 years ago, when for the first time the Qajar dynasty showed an approach, and Firuze Kashani Sabit has written extensively about this, that the health of the nation mothers became important. But Iran has had 5 different approaches, 3 of them policies, towards the population control. Under the Qajar, it was to improve mother and child's health. Under the Pahlavis in the 60s, when the population was growing at the rate of 3.1, Iran joined the International Conference for Population, and they tried to implement antinatalist policies, which was not very successful. Then the Islamic Revolution happened, and the antinatalist policies were dismantled. And within a few years, the population started growing at 3.9, as we saw earlier. So that was a policy. And then, since the 1979 revolution, Iran has had 3 different population policies, each one of them contradicting the previous one. So the reproductive life of the citizens is like a tap. The state is expecting to turn on and off and ask them to change their values, reproductive values. Now you can produce, and now you don't produce. And this is why the younger generation is resistant and resents that. And finally, the Shia jurists have played a significant role in paving the way to reconcile modernity with tradition, through issuing fatwas in a number of areas, including, for example, kidney donation, organ donation, reproductive technologies, and so many other areas. So in conclusion, we also see that a lot of the recent studies are saying that Iranians are confused about their identity, and in what they are constantly going from transgressing to conformity and back and forth, and therefore they are going through identity crisis. My studies show that what is called identity crisis is in fact the fact that young people, having transgressed, they find means to going back to conformity. It's an effort to try to bridge the gap between modernity and tradition without disturbing the social order. Like, as I said, for example, women transgressing sexually and then restoring their hymen so they can be seen to be virgins. But that doesn't stop at just that. People at all levels transgress, but some of them in order so they can go back to conformity. For example, the Shia jurists, when they allow the third-party donation, they have redefined the lineage. The lineage from being blood link was actually defined as a contract between the donor of the gamete and the recipient. This is a form of transgression, but the ultimate has been to allow families to be produced and happy families to be formed. So that is something which has come up again and again. So modernity and tradition, or the conformity and transgression, are used to bridge the gap between modernity and tradition. So what I can say is that so far reproduction and its adjacent institutions have been the custodians of core cultural norms or values. Whether and for how long these norms, beliefs, and practices remain valid requires obviously continuous in-depth research.
Thank you very much for that very rich discussion. Really appreciate it. I mean, your book has just got so many aspects to it. Just a few strands of it. You go through this history of what you just called a tap water idea of reproduction, right? So the government wants to bring down fertility, and then during the Pahlavi regime, it's not very successful. Then during the early years of the revolution, they remove all those, so the population then goes up. And then in the 80s, they decide that they can't deal with this much population, so they try to bring it down again. But this time they bring it down through actually education and contraceptives and family clinics and things like that. And it becomes a very, very successful. So that's one story. Then you have the story of people who want to conceive and cannot conceive, right? At the same time. I mean, these are going at the same time. And then the stories of various clinics and assisted reproductive technology and how they're using it. But then you also have this theme running through your book of abrudari, saving face. And that's kind of where the story becomes far more complicated, because it's not just that people are dealing with government policies. And it's not just that the policies keep changing back and forth, but that there's also this desire to sort of keep the peace in the family. And so how do they go about their decision to have children, to have no children, to conceive by artificial insemination, and at the same time maintain this face, right? So that seems to me a level of conversation that's going on between husband and wife to be able to do that. I mean, you do talk about sometimes it's sort of hidden, but I imagine in most cases there's a conversation going on. And the other thing, which seems to me there's a level of conversation going on between husband and wife, is the government's inability in the last several years, really decade, to try to increase the population, and they're not succeeding in that, right? And so that also suggests to me that there's a level of conversation going on between men and women, because it takes two to get pregnant, right? Last I checked. And so what's happening here is that I'm trying to say that beneath the woman life freedom movement that we saw, there seems to me this very, very important and significant conversation going on between young people, between couples, between those who are dating, those who are in white marriages, perhaps, and those who are married, to try to basically control birth. And would you mind saying something about that? And I have some really lovely questions from the audience that we're going to turn to in a minute.
Right. Well, obviously, any generalization is wrong. I'm relying on whatever one says, you can also show the opposite that does exist. But what I am really saying is, unless one can get actually deeply involved in people's lives, because the first lesson in anthropology is people don't do what they say they do. You know, it's always one story that we hear by talking to people. It's another story when you actually live with people. I mean, gain more of insight into their lives. So there are all sorts of aspects to all that. For example, when the movement of Mahsa, I mean, his life, freedom, women happened, you probably saw more men in the street in support of women, which was wonderful to see. But then when you went back into the houses of these people, I have some examples, and I'm not generalizing. I'm not saying that is the case with everybody, but I saw some of the more conservative people, women who were carers in households, went back to their house every evening. And the same brothers or husbands or fathers who had been out demonstrating in favor against the death of Mahsa Amini, who were beating up these girls to get the money they had earned from them. So how do I reconcile these two? But again, forgive me, I am not generalizing. But what I'm really saying, yes, we don't know. On the other hand, I do know that years ago, I was in Iran on that mission that I mentioned, and the driver who was driving me back and forth was married to his wife for 15 years, and they didn't have any children. And I said, are you going to go and have an IVF treatment? He said, no, I love my wife and we're very happy as we are. We don't want children. So, you know, one needs to do a lot more research, especially in the changing society connected to the political events as well.
Very much.
Yeah,
so let me ask you some of the questions that we've got, and there's quite a bit of them. One is, what do you think is the main reason for the high degree of male infertility in Iran?
Yes, well, obviously, nobody knows the complete reasons for male infertility, but one of the reasons is consanguineous marriages, family marriages. The male infertility is transmitted down the line, male line. Therefore, if a man is infertile, when you can be sort of, that is one of the reasons why they think, infertility is inherited down the male line. There have been a lot of probably venereal diseases around. They have been I really don't know why, but speaking with the doctors at the clinic, IVF clinics, they say 50% of cases of male infertility, but they are not being given recognitions because men lose face. It is infertility still generally remains a stigma, but the male infertility remains a bigger stigma. I mean, we have examples of the man infertility when he was told that he was the infertile party. He said to his wife, "You have got to admit that you are the infertile party, or I'll divorce you."
I see. Right.
You know, so it's not actually so well known, but I think it is internationally. There is still research going on about male infertility.
Yeah, in particular, it seems that in Middle East, there are really high rates of male infertility, probably ecological issues. So that brings us to the next question. As someone who decided not to have kids primarily because of environmental concerns, how are ecological concerns like water scarcity or pollution affecting perspectives on family planning and reproduction in Iran?
I haven't done any specific research in that area, so I am not aware what is the extent of awareness of the environment as a reason for not having children. Maybe the younger educated people would be concerned about it, but I don't have any information on that.
Okay. Here's a question from Sabah Mir Hosseini. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, Dr. Tremayne. I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on the emancipatory aspects of family planning following the revolution. Do you think that family planning initiatives may have, albeit inadvertently, provided women with some degree of autonomy in the 1980s and 90s, something that probably the Islamic regime did not expect?
Exactly. You have pointed your finger on that. Absolutely. One of my colleague Homa Hoodfar has written extensively about this aspect, and there's some of it I also in the book in one of the chapters. So that the policy planners who were implementing the antinatalist policies of the 1980s did realize that unless they could bring women on board, they are not going to succeed. Therefore, women were addressed and they were included in the family planning. And because the religious leaders and authorities approved of the family planning at the time, it empowered women to stand up to their men, because their men didn't want, they still were beating their wives up for using contraceptive pills. And they would say, Agha himself, meaning Ayatollah Khomeini, has told us that we shouldn't have too many children. So that gave them some form of power. But again, to gain insights, talking to midwives and nurses who were working in the rural areas, they said, many of these women, we go and knock on every door to give women, because they are due for their contraceptive pills every month. They hide them under the ground so their husbands don't know that they are using that. Back in 2004, when I was in Yazd, in the clinic, a woman had come who was pregnant, whose husband had raped her because she was using contraceptive pills, and she was begging to have an abortion. So, that went on for a very long time, but it empowered women definitely to actually do that. And education has had a big effect. As I gave you the example of my story, children coming home from school, saying, we have been told not to have too many children. Yes, definitely. It empowered women in a big way.
That was really fascinating that you have children telling their mothers and essentially that you shouldn't be having. So that's something they're learning in school, and they're bringing back to the family. That was really quite an interesting point. We have a question here from Mona Tajalli. She says, it's great to learn from you again. And she has a question. If you can please comment on whether the reproduction policies in the recent decades are also being paired with social policies such as maternal, paternal leave, which, as we know, research shows are very important for supporting reproduction in our changing societies. When I interviewed then Vice President for Women's Affairs in 2016, Mola Verdi, this was one of the policies she was pursuing and trying to work with employers in public and private sectors to safeguard women's positions for the time of leave. She was even hoping to extend it to several months. Are there policy-making efforts also on supporting childcare and the like?
Supporting what?
Childcare and the like.
Childcare. Yes, I think actually these pro-natalist policies are offering a great number of incentives to people. For example, one of the things they say, anybody who has got more than 3 children, men can be exempt from military service. Well, these men are 19, 20 years old. I mean, having 3 children already by the age of 20. They're offering incentive. They are offering, talking about childcare, providing childcare policy. Of course, many of them say, well, women shouldn't work. They should stay at home and have children and look after them. Again, some of the people who had been, because of the incentives that the policies are offering them, although they are not infertile, they are coming to infertile clinics asking for triplets, to have triplets so they can benefit. The government is offering them land, offering them money. But I have seen interviews in the BBC and other media that some couples are saying, well, we went and had 3 children, but we haven't seen any of the promises of the government to us.
So what you're saying is that the infertile couples might be more receptive to these things because, of course, they want to have children, and so maybe more than one, but that if you've decided you don't want to have children, or if decided not to really have as many, then they're not that effective, right?
No, those people are not affected, but some of the people who need the money or the land or whatever, they want to follow the religious line and authorities. They do go. But you see, I mean, that is in an article which is still to be published. It's not yet published in a book about the future of fertilities. I have argued that the government policy was to also, the government, when the IVF treatment happened in the first place, the government was not at all interested in infertility. That was in the 1980s, late 1970s. It was the private sector which started all this treatment. But when the infertility went down to such a drastic level, one of the strands of the policies became to increase the number of IVF clinics. So the government has and provide free treatment because it's very expensive, the cost. Okay. However, the argument is the success rate of IVF treatment is maximum 30%. So even in the very successful cases, even if women come back for a second one, and the effect, psychological and physical effect on women undergoing this treatment is serious. So even if they have 2 children, would they come back for a third child? If they have only 2 children, that's not going to add to the population growth. So
this next question might actually be related to your next book. In your opinion, what might Iran's demographic landscape look like in coming decades if current reproductive trends continue? What could be the social and economic impacts of these changes?
Well, this question, it's a very much a sort of universal question because fertility is declining everywhere, especially in the Middle East. I mean, my colleague Marcia Inhor has written extensively about it, how the population in the Middle East is also dropping, as it is elsewhere. I mean, when you read the newspapers, every day there is talk of this worry about South Korea, China, Japan, Italy, everywhere. The population is dropping. I think one of the answers, if the people in a country like Iran are not going to be prepared to increase that, migration is one of the possibilities. And this is what policymakers in Europe are beginning to look at. I mean, there's so many anti-migration movements at the moment in the West, but in the end, with the declining population, migration is one of the answers. So
I mean, that's just like a no-brainer, right?
It's no-brainer.
Everywhere in the world, everywhere in Europe, in America.
Yeah.
America actually has less of a problem in this regard. Europe really has a big problem. Migration is the answer. And yet we have, also in Iran, we have quite a bit of hostility towards Afghans. I'm sure the rates of reproduction are much higher. they're closer ethnically, linguistically, religious-wise to the mainland population.
Yeah.
But of course, the government is also abusing them, giving them, offering them citizenship in return for their fighting in Syria or elsewhere. So, yeah, so they have both things happening here. Let's see. I have a question here from Mariame Yousefzadeh. We know that infertility has to do with use of chemicals in food and stress levels. What is Iran doing about that?
I don't know. I don't think they are doing anything. I mean, their policies are so coercive at the moment. As you know, abortion under any form is banned. One of the authorities in Iran actually said, we don't mind having disabled children, severely disabled, thalassemia affected children. We just want more population. So whether the government, as you know, many of the environmentalists doing research had been arrested. So how much of that is accepted that chemicals are a cause of infertility? I don't know. I mean, I don't have real detailed information on that, but I know that the government is so focused in forcing people to have more children that they are not talking about let's find the cause of infertility.
Can you walk us through the method in which the government is actually forcing women and families to have children? Like, so when you become pregnant, I mean, there are tests that you have to do.
Yes.
3 months, there are tests you have to do 5th month. So what is it? The doctor has to report people? Is that what it is?
That's right. I think they have got to report. The scanning, prenatal scanning has been banned because they don't want to know.
My God.
Oh yes, that's been going on for some time. Abortion on all its form is banned. Yes, women are being actually. It reminds me very much of Ceausescu's policies. With every woman was tested every month for pregnancy, so they don't go and abort. And Iran is nearing that. I mean, they are brutal in their looking at in their implementing their pro-natalist policies. But again, as I have explained before, when the government has these policies, people will always find ways around it. I mean, people are still managing to get contraceptive pills. Some of it is harmful because they are not the real ones. The rate of abortion it's not just unmarried women going for abortion, it's couples. It's about over 300,000 per year. And I think this is an underestimation. That is happening right now.
So the same way that they found a way for cable television before, exactly. and for drinking and alcohol and everything, they figured out a way to get contraceptives. And I imagine morning after pills too, right?
Possibly, yes. And people are in touch with the outside world. They receive tablets, medication, abortion, whichever way they can. Absolutely. I think in every area of policy, not just reproduction, when the policies of the government doesn't suit people, they always find ways to skirt around the policies and carry on living their own lives. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. These were just amazing inputs into the situation in Iran. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about where people can obtain your book?
Where the book is published by Berghahn Books. They have got a website. It's under our series, Fertility, Reproduction, and Sexuality series. Actually, my book was volume number 50, but we are hearing number 60 volumes in it.
Have there been other volumes in the series pertaining to Iran?
There is one, Rahil. Yes, it is about the Iranian in Holland.
In general, it's about these questions globally, right?
It is very much about all aspects of reproduction, and we have got two, I think, about Iran in the series, and some of them can be bought at discount, and of course, I'm sure probably Amazon has got them too.
That's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your talk today.
I'm thanking you. It has been a privilege and a pleasure to share my work with you.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Tremayne, for joining us today and for sharing this talk about your latest book, Inconceivable Iran. This topic is certainly something that is fascinating to learn about and needs the incredible attention you have placed on it. For audience members, please note that you may purchase the copy of the book via the link in the chat or in the recording's descriptions when the recording of this conversation will be posted. Once again, we like to thank Dr. Janet Afari and her entire team at UC Santa Barbara for organizing this annual lecture series with Farhang Foundation. As always, we invite you to visit farhang.org for all our latest upcoming events, performances, talks, and programs. We thank you all for joining us from all over the world today and spending your Saturday with us, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. Until then, we bid you all farewell. Thank you very much, Dr. Tremayne. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you, Dr. Afari. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.